Joining me now is the author of international bestsellers, including his latest on democracies and death cults. Douglas Murray, I'm interested in your thoughts on the significance of Charlie Kirk's legacy to American political life and the wider culture. But let's start with the UN, and President Donald Trump addressed the United Nations General Assembly earlier today. And he criticised European allies over everything from green energy obsessions to immigration policies. And the UN itself didn't escape scrutiny either.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action.
Douglas, have you also wondered what is the point of the UN?
Well, many people have wondered about that for many decades now. It's some 40 years ago or so since American ambassadors have said very similar things. The problem for the UN has always been that the number of democracies in the world show up. They tend to get castigated by the non-democracies in the world. The free countries get lambasted by unfree countries, and everyone has to pretend that say, you know, an elected leader in a democracy is on an even pegging with some thuggish dictator from somewhere else in the world. And of course, you know, that's a sort of nicety. Unfortunately, a lot of people fall into the trap of believing that as a result, the UN is what it says it is and is the sort of ultimate court of the world. And, you know, while some things can be hashed out there, I have always thought that it is important that democratically elected leaders of countries like the US do things like Trump did today and call out the UN's failings. Otherwise, it's just a sort of talking shop for demagogues and dictators to launder their reputations in New York City.
Now, the president had this to say about mass migration, including illegal immigration and economic migrants seeking asylum.
Proud nations must be allowed to protect their communities and prevent their societies from being overwhelmed by people they have never seen before, with different customs, religions, with different everything. Where migrants have violated laws, lodged false asylum claims, or claimed refugee status.
Douglas, he's talking about essentially what you wrote about so many years ago, the strange death of Europe.
Yes, a book which is, of course, not just about Europe, but about America, Canada, Australia, all the Western liberal democracies, all of which have had more than a generation of insane immigration policies, and which have just not been able to wrestle their way out of the problem that generations, actually, of politicians have got us into, of all political parties. What Trump said is completely true, and of course will go down like a cup of cold sick with almost all of his allies, because, you know, governments like those in Australia and Britain and so on do this thing of like talking endlessly about our openness and our diversity and so on. And Trump made one of the observations that, yes, I mean, I've made for many years, which is why is it only the Western democracies that have to undergo this? Why is it that we're not allowed to defend our own borders? Why are we not allowed to have our own customs and culture, but instead only define ourselves by our diversity and much more? And as you and I have said before, Rita, one of the historic things which Trump is showing, and if he can pull it off with Homan and others, then it'll be really seismic, is to show that the illegal migration and the dissolution of Western cultures is not inevitable. That you can actually have an orderly migration policy, you can have borders, you can defend those borders, you can have laws, you can have asylum policies, but you can have none of those things if you've decided that basically anyone who walks into your country illegally has the right to stay and enjoy all the benefits of being in these countries, despite, in most cases, not having contributed anything to them and not being likely to contribute anything meaningful to them either. Yes, what he said was completely true. And doubtless, as I say, all of his allies will abhor his comments and think how incredibly backward President Trump is to voice such sentiments. Whereas in actual fact, in the rotation that politics can often be, the rotating game that politics can often be, maybe Donald Trump is the voice from the future on all this.
And finally, on President Trump's UN address, he blasted countries, including France, Britain, Australia, for recognising Palestine. He said, Douglas, that effectively rewards the terrorism we saw on October 7.
Yeah. Well, he's completely right about that. Hamas has, of course, already thanked Keir Starmer and others for saying that they recognize a state of Palestine. It's pure posturing by Albanese, Carney, Starmer, Macron. As I've said to you before, Rita, after all, I mean, I think the era where heads of state in Britain and France and so on can create and carve out states in far-off continents is over. I think most people, particularly from the political left, were rather pleased that's over. These unilateral declarations of recognition of statehood are totally meaningless for a whole pile of reasons. But just to list some of them in short order, there is no agreed state of Palestine. There is no agreed Palestinian leadership. There are no agreed borders. There are no agreed. There's no agreed capital. There's no agreement on what land swaps or anything else would look like, and there's no evidence from what Palestinian leadership exists, whether in Gaza with the remains of Hamas or with Judea and Samaria with the Palestinian Authority. There's no evidence at all that they're remotely willing to live in peace with their neighbors. And of course, Hamas see this as a victory. They invaded Israel almost 2 years ago and massacred and raped and kidnapped their way across the south. And within under 2 years, all of these Western governments that said they would stand with the victims, they would stand with Israel, they would demand the release of the hostages, have done next to nothing to get the hostages out, done next to nothing to stop Hamas for the last 20 or more years, and instead now have given this unilateral declaration which simply rewards the terrorists. I mean, they could have at least said, we are not even going to think about recognizing a so-called Palestinian state until every hostage that Hamas stole is taken from where they're being held and returned to their families. And until that, nothing. They couldn't even hold that line. So we've all seen who they are, all these Macrons and Albaneses and things. And the final thing to say on that is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was completely right when he said in the aftermath of President Trump's address, he was completely right, Rubio, when he said all these leaders, Australia, Canada, Britain, France, they're not doing this because they can create a Palestinian state. They can't. They're doing it for domestic political reasons, because people like Albanese think that they can stop the protests and mollify the radical Palestinianists in their own countries if they do this. You know what? They can't. But look at the lesson that Italy has showed us. Giorgia Meloni didn't join in this idiotic and hollow stampede. And there were riots yesterday in Milan as a result, with crowds of immigrants and Palestinianist activists, far leftists, smashing up shops in Milan because Meloni wouldn't do this baloney act of pretending that she can create a Palestinian state. So that's all that these other Western leaders have done. They've done it to mollify the mobs at home. And, well, maybe they think they'll buy themselves peace for a few minutes, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Now, Douglas, we're coming to you from Charlie Kirk's beloved Phoenix, where he headquartered Turning Point USA, and where his funeral was held on Sunday. It was an incredible event on so many levels. How did you see the memorial, and what do you see as Charlie's lasting legacy?
Well, I think it's really the beginning of that legacy. A number of the speakers at the memorial on Sunday in Phoenix made reference to the fact that, you know, the assassin who killed Charlie thought that he was going to silence him, and it's exactly the opposite. He's given Charlie's voice a wider range than it ever could have had in his lifetime. It's an extraordinary thing, and a demonstration that people who use violence to pursue political means should, among many other things, apart from the fact that it's evil, not do that because the consequences may well be ones that they cannot foresee. I thought it was extremely moving. It was a remarkable demonstration of solidarity and support from tens of thousands of people, of course, dominated by Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica, and her remarkable speech. But I also think, Rita, as you've noticed as well, that really one of the striking things was the prominence of the Christian message at the heart of it all. Many of us are used to sort of watered down forms of Christianity, particularly in the Western democracies. And this wasn't that. It was literally preaching of the gospel by, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others. And I think that legacy is going to be one of the most powerful that Charlie Kirk has not just left behind, but started.
Do you see that as important in fighting back for Western values and reaffirming those Judeo-Christian values?
Well, it's something I wrote about a lot in The Strange Death of Europe a decade ago, as you mentioned, which is that we are in a complicated place in the history of the West, because what we enjoy and our rights and our liberties and much more come from our Judeo-Christian roots. There's no doubt about that. And anyone who says otherwise is simply trying to retrofit the multicultural model onto our societies. Our liberties and our rights and much more, our freedoms, come from a very specific and unusual, in many ways, religious theological tradition. And the question, as the former Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, pointed out, was whether or not Western civilization can survive if it cuts itself off from the roots that gave it birth. That's a question which many people have mulled over in recent years. And in some ways, it's been answered, which is no, that if you completely cut yourself off from your religious roots in the Judeo-Christian West, you end up with weird new wacko religions being founded, whether it's Palestinianism or transgenderism or all of these look at me-isms. And you just sort of create this vacuum into which strange new heresies and beliefs wander. So it's an open question in the West whether there is another way, or whether the way back is the one that Pope Benedict talked about, the one that Charlie Kirk obviously believed in, which is that the West should return to its roots. That's a very complicated issue for society, but it's certainly one that we should think about and engage in. And that is a challenge for everyone, I think, believers, non-believers alike, which is whether or not we can recognize the source that has given us what is good in our societies, or whether we just repudiate it, reject it, and see where the winds blow us.
Beautifully said. Now, you wrote about the violence we are seeing in the US from elements of the left who, you argue, have a history of celebrating or excusing those guilty of these acts of political violence. And on that, we've also had President Trump designating Antifa as a terrorist organisation. I know you wrote about that also for the New York Post. Do you think Antifa deserve to be labelled terrorists? And please just expand on what you're talking about as far as elements of the left having a very permissive attitude to violence.
Well, I would play it any other way around, that if there was a group, whether organized at a normal structural level or a sort of slightly more amorphous blob of entities across the country, if there was such a movement that came from the political right, which, for instance, had spent years smashing up federal buildings and privately owned businesses, which has spent years firing guns on the streets, attacking police officers, attacking journalists, and hospitalizing, almost killing journalists who look into their activities, I think that this thing would have been shut down years ago. And Antifa has been allowed to run because too many people have taken it at its word that it is an anti-fascist organization. It isn't. It's a fascist
Yes.
organization. You can tell literally from the way they behave. They dress up in black, they mask their faces, and they beat their opponents to a pulp on the ground in American cities. I think that there's a question as to whether or not Donald Trump, whether in America you could designate them a terrorist organization. But the one thing you can absolutely do is use the powers of the state to arrest people who are routinely breaking the law and making life unlivable in the American cities which they dominate in, places like Portland, places in recent years like Seattle and parts of California and elsewhere. It's a very big challenge, but it's one that I think the Trump administration should rise itself to the moment on. As for the wider pool, Rita, it's just very striking to me. And as I said in that City Journal piece, again, you've just got to play it the other way around. There are people who engage in political violence from all sides. But I think it would be surprising if somebody, for instance, involved in terrorism, right-wing terrorism, would find themselves lauded on American campuses and given berths and speaking appointments and much more. And I mentioned there in passing Angela Davis and her own history of radicalism. And she was just honored by Cambridge University in England with an honorary degree. And this is somebody with a putrid record in activism, a disgusting record in activism, and no distinction in academic thought. But she gets honored. Same things with people like Leila Khalid, the PFLP hijacker. These people that the left has unfortunately particularly venerated are people who've been venerated not in spite of having a history of violence and connections with violence, but as if that frisson of violence is part of the thrill, part of the reason to promote them. And I think that just as I would expect the right to have a look at itself if it was marinating in those waters, so I think the left really should, and again, especially after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, really should look at what it has been encouraging on its own side. And it should remember that instead of thinking that it's always the good guy, let's at least concede that violence can come from all sides. But if it comes from your side, you have a disproportionate necessity to condemn it and to make sure that the gray zone of violence isn't one that our societies are allowed to exist in, but that we have a hard no. The hard no against political assassination, whoever is the target. A hard no against the pursuit of violence in politics, whatever the aim that's being pursued. If we could do that, left and right could show a degree of hygiene on their own sides, then some good can come out of these terrible circumstances.
Douglas Murray, thank you for your time.